on 1 Timothy.
In preparation for this class, you should read 1 Timothy, Notes and Outlines for 1 Timothy by J. Vernon McGee, the Pastoral Epistles, a commentary on 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus by J.R. Enzi, 1 Timothy chapter 1 through 1 Timothy chapter 6, and Epistles by Ralph Reynolds, Paul's first letter to Timothy, parts 1, 2, and 3. By the time you finish with this class, you will relate the outline from the McGee commentary, cite the 2 key verses from 1 Timothy, relate doctrines derived from 1 Timothy 2 regarding women's hair ornamentation and women's dress, name and explain the requirements for an overseer or bishop from chapter 3, relate Paul's references to the importance of right doctrine from chapter 4, describe the requirements of a widow indeed from chapter 5, and relate Paul's admonishments to flee from some things and to pursue other things, and how this applies to your own ministry from chapter 6.
We have no doubt that the epistle was written by Paul, and that about the year 64 CE. Contrary to some misinformation, Paul does not die imprisoned in Rome at the end of the book of Acts, but rather he is released from prison between the years 64 and 67. I personally believe it was immediately before the burning of Rome in 64. He wrote this first epistle to Timothy, as well as his epistle to Titus, at about the same time, probably from Macedonia. As we've discussed, the theme is that of the organization and governing of the believers in a church for a common purpose, that of bearing the fruit of new converts. 2 key verses are found first in 1 Timothy 1:3. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus, so that you may command certain men not to teach false doctrines any longer. Also, in 1 Timothy 3:15, Paul warns that, if I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth. Sound doctrine and correct conduct identify the local church. Of note are key words that Paul emphasizes because of their repetition. The word doctrine occurs 8 times. Godliness occurs 8 times. The word teach and teacher occurs 7 times. And good occurs 22 times in these 6 chapters. It would be helpful in your study of 1 Timothy to have an outline handy. This outline follows the way the epistle is set into chapters, so it's easy to remember. Chapter 1 is Faith of the Church, an introduction in verses 1 through 2, a warning against unsound doctrine in verses 3 through 11, the personal testimony of Paul in verses 12 through 17, and a charge to Timothy in verses 18 through 20. Chapter 2 is public prayer and women's place in the churches. Public prayer for the public and public officials is in verses 1 through 7. How men are to pray in verse 8, and how women are to pray in verses 9 through 15. Chapter 3 describes officers in the church. Requirements of elders is in verses 1 through 7. Requirements for deacons is in verses 8 through 13. And a report of Paul to Timothy is in verses 14 through 16. Chapter 4 is apostasy in the churches, how to recognize the apostates in verses 1 through 5, and what the good minister can do in times of apostasy in verses 6 through 16. Chapters 5 and 6 are duties of officers of the churches. The relationship of ministers to different groups in the local church is chapter 5, and the relationship of believers to others is in chapter 6. The commentaries that follow will fall closely in line with this outline. At this point, you should have completed reading 3 commentaries on 1 Timothy chapter 1, one by J. Vernon McGee, another by Ralph Reynolds, and the third by J.R. Enzi. Rather than having a lesson that would essentially be a commentary on commentaries, I want to make sure you have thoroughly read these 3 commentaries. You should notice especially where each of these 3 agree, and perhaps where 1 or 2 of them diverge in their interpretation of a particular verse. Also note when one of the commentators brings out a deeper meaning or a better translation of a particular term. Remembering one of the important rules of biblical interpretation, a word in the Bible doesn't mean what it means in English or in whatever language you normally read the Bible, but rather a word means what it meant to the writer in the original language, in this case, what it meant to Paul in Greek.
In preparation for the next class, you should read 2 Timothy, Notes and Outlines for 2 Timothy by J. Vernon McGee, the Pastoral Epistles, a commentary on 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus by J.R. Enzi, the second epistle of Paul to the Apostle to Timothy, and Epistles by Ralph Reynolds, Paul's second letter to Timothy, parts 1 and 2.